Benito Mussolini and Fascist Italy are often regarded as the lesser partner in the Axis alliance. After all, Germany was the mighty power of Europe and Japan the mighty power of Asia. This way of looking at things has even left some to joke that Italy was merely the mighty power of Africa given its ambitions on Ethiopia and the Maghreb. But this oversimplified view of the Second Great War does a massive disservice to the threat that Italy had posed to the old order of power held up by France and Britain, and undermines the true skill and ambition which Italy's Duce had possessed. Here to help us explore that is our good friend Carson Wolf.
Howdy guys, I'm Carson Wolf, here to help you guys understand some of the complexities that built Mussolini's empire. Let's start from the beginning. The young Mussolini was from a small town of blacksmiths and masons and had a very humble beginning. He grew up attending a Catholic school but was often buried in his old books that glorified Roman folklore and medieval Europe. In school he was shy, but unsurprisingly he would often get into clashes with his teachers who he thought were trying to indoctrinate him. Prior to the First World War, Benito Mussolini was nothing like the Duce that he would become. Mussolini was a depressed, directionless, unemployed 20-year-old. Since graduating from school, he had struggled to find a job where most of the time people of his age were not working due to economic restructuring. Instead, he found himself filling the directionless void with radical ideologies. But surprisingly, he began his political journey as a key proponent of anarcho-syndicalist movement of Italy. Yep, that's right. Mussolini was a socialist, and he went on to become a popular writer, founding a publication that would garner hundreds of thousands of viewers. His writing led Mussolini to become a notable figure of the Italian left as he rose through the ranks of the Italian Socialist Party, but Mussolini found himself frustrated with the Socialist Party's devotion to principles of egalitarianism, social progressivism relating to gender and homosexuality. Most importantly, though, Mussolini was not an internationalist, he was a nationalist. Mussolini had grown up reading the Western novels and epic contemporary stories of war. The poetry in these novels painted a world of supposed ancient grandeur, honor, and empire. Thus, Mussolini believed that the principles being upheld by the socialists were antithetical to the pursuit of a greater Italy and the prosperity of the Italian worker. And this ultimately led to his expulsion from the Italian Socialist Party. But there was still a large segment of people within the party who sided with Mussolini, who followed him out, leading to the creation of the National Fascist Party. Mussolini built on the ideas of Italian futurism, which was an artistic movement of the early 1900s. The futurists used art to glorify the development of technology, the revolutionary youth, the car, the airplane, and industrial society as they represented the triumph of humanity over nature. It developed this idea of a new industrial Rome. Mussolini was very attracted to this and modeled his fascist movement according to the tenets of futurism. That is also what makes fascism so unique in the fact that it began as an artistic movement rather than a political one. The movement really had only a small political framework. The doctrine of fascism is about 25 pages long. Instead, it was a vision that was tailored to the Italian people, that offered them a vision of Rome being at the center of the Latin world and culture again. Mussolini was essentially the avatar, the embodiment of the struggle of his age. Italy, like most nations who took part in the First Great War, was very liberal. Very, very liberal. Following the liberal revolutions of the late 19th century, the Kingdom of Italy began to shift leftwards. Sure, the monarchy would remain, and the Catholic Church guided much of society, but these truths were more in theory than they were in reality. Radically liberal social norms began to reshape Italian society. Homosexuality became normalized. Precursors to the feminist movement dominated social obligations. Consumerism took control of the nation, all while the nation industrialized, thus bringing forth worse working conditions for the working class. And meanwhile, the church took a back seat in public life. Consumerism tried to unsuccessfully fill that void, and at the end of the war, Italians felt directionless and isolated. The liberal governments had essentially created a tinderbox of directionless people in the population. They were just waiting for a national strongman to come in, offer them a position in service of his vision, and transform the nation. And that strongman was Mussolini, who promised an end to social chaos, to liberal dominance, to Italy being but a footnote in the European theater, to unemployment, to rising crime, and to the humiliation of Italy as a nation. Mussolini was a dreamer, given all the fantasy books he'd read in his youth about the glory of Rome and modern wars. This influenced him to strive to form a new Latin Bloc of Europe, with Italy as its crown. And thus he became the Duce, who would lead Italy and create the first Italian empire.
In foreign policy, Mussolini was a pragmatist. He saw opportunity in aligning with multiple powers. Of course, we all know about the Pact of Steel between Italy and Germany, but Mussolini had also considered France and Britain as perfectly viable allies up until then, not to mention his envisioned Latin Bloc, which would have encompassed Italy, Spain, Portugal, France, and potentially Romania. Romania would in fact later revive the concept of a Latin Axis during the war. In regard to France and Britain, this represents perhaps the greatest deviation from the Italy we seem to remember, as the three powers had come together in 1935 specifically as a check against Germany. This Stresa Front, as it became known, was intended to protect the sovereign integrity of Austria against a German Anschluss, and prevent German violations of the Versailles Treaty. France and Britain held an interest in restricting German expansion, while Italy saw Austria as a potential invaluable ally who shared in their Catholic and nationalist ideals. Austria had been led by Engelbert Dollfuss and his Austrian Fatherland Front up until its assassination by German agents in 1934. While the Fatherland Front continued to maintain power, Germany was making clear its ambitions, and many worried that it would only be a matter of time before Austria was annexed. The Stresa Front, meant to secure Austria's integrity and which would have kept Italy out of the Axis, ultimately dissolved on account of Britain's willingness to allow Germany to significantly expand its navy via the Anglo-German Naval Agreement of 1935. Italy's subsequent invasion of Ethiopia would mark the country's break of faith in France and Britain to stand as an effective check against Germany, and the beginning of Italy seeing Germany as a more viable ally. But what if that changed? What if in an alternate timeline, Italy never joined the Axis powers? Hello audience, Mr. Z here with another alternate history scenario for you. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We have videos like this every week, so be sure to subscribe and stay tuned. Before we go any further, folks, if you want to see me and Carson in person along with some other great speakers, we'll be in West Palm Beach, Florida on the 15th for the one and maybe only ever Dean Pack. Links will be in the description and comments below. Now, back to the video. The success of the Stresa Front could have very well been the make-or-break factor for Italy, ingratiating itself to France and Britain, proving to Austria its value as a protective neighbor, and most significantly, severing the opportunity for rapprochement with Germany. For the sake of this scenario, we're going to suppose that the 1935 Anglo-German Naval Agreement is never signed, kicking off a sequence of events. Germany loses faith in the prospects of an Anglo-German alliance against Soviet Russia. Britain demonstrates that it will not follow a policy of appeasement, which reassures both France and Italy. And Italy, not feeling betrayed by Britain's compromise and reassured of this alliance's value, does not invade Ethiopia, or at the very least postpones its invasion. Italy had been determined to rectify the humiliation it suffered during its first invasion of Ethiopia years prior, however Britain opposed this. The matter was meant to be discussed during the initial planning of this alliance, but seemingly was not expressed clearly enough. In this alternate timeline, to prevent an immediate breaking of the alliance by Italy, Britain would make explicitly clear that an invasion of Ethiopia would violate the terms of the alliance. The Italians, realizing that Ethiopia could wait and that there were greater factors in play, would accept this outcome for the sake of securing its place among the powers of Europe and isolating Germany. By this point in time, Germany had kicked its remilitarization program into high gear, unilaterally voiding the Treaty of Versailles' military clauses. What followed in 1936 may have given the Stresa Front just cause to finally intervene against Germany. 1936 would see the German remilitarization of the Rhineland, a border region between France and Germany. This had in part been motivated by the emergence of a Franco-Soviet Mutual Defense Pact, which itself had been motivated by Germany's remilitarization program. Germany's actions would be an explicit violation of past agreements and directly threaten French security. In our world, France and Britain hesitated to involve themselves, but this time, with the more belligerent Italy on their side, and with Britain not pursuing appeasement, action would be taken. In terms of sheer military might, the French still held an advantage over the Germans by this point, however were held back by financial difficulties and internal political tensions. The French would actually devalue their currency and abandon the gold standard later that same year in an effort to stimulate the French economy. In this alternate timeline, that devaluing of their currency may come earlier, or France may seek a loan from London should the conflict drag on. Germany had only really just initiated its remilitarization and was still testing the waters of what it could get away with. Had the Germans been given a show of force by the Western powers this early on, it's quite possible they would have conceded for the sake of focusing on internal renewal rather than expansion. Of course, remilitarization efforts would need to be snuffed out. What might be seen as a renegotiation of German military limitations which would still keep them low, but allow for defensive increases within reason. With that, Germany would be effectively neutralized, with the Stresa Front solidifying into a reliable check against it. Or would it? It must be mentioned how much value Italy held to France. Britain's geographic and political separation from the continent and France's position of sharing a border with Germany left the French feeling isolated and vulnerable. The French very desperately sought a military power which could reliably support them on the continent, and while Italy was in a better position to aid France militarily than Britain, it was ultimately Britain's economic might which kept France looking northward instead of southward. However, the French recognized that in the long term Britain and Italy would clash over Africa, particularly within the northern coast and eastern horn. the latter of which France felt Italy should hold free reign over. France, as we could see from our timeline, preferred Britain, but was frustrated by the Empire's failure to commit to a continental alliance. Italy, on the other hand, craved this, knowing very well that it could not stand alone either. And so with Germany out of play in the mind of Britain, who would slowly return to an internal focus, Italy would soon succeed in swaying the French over to their side as Britain removed itself from continental affairs. The cohesion of this alliance would be tested mere months after Germany's attempted remilitarization of the Rhineland with the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War. Mussolini and Italy of course provided direct support to Franco and his nationalist forces, while France, then under the divided left-wing government of Léon Blum, found sympathies with the Republicans and provided them covert aid. Britain attempted to remain largely neutral. Blum's new government would spell a cold period between France and Italy, but that wouldn't stop Italian efforts at fostering close ties with nationalist factions within France while simultaneously building relations with the far-right Salazar government in Portugal and with Romania, where fascist sympathetic governments were rising in influence, albeit in seeming competition with one another. Romania could serve as another point of contention between Italy and Germany, with the two having supported rival factions. Prior to this, Romania had been somewhat aligned with France and only broke with them following their inability to prevent Germany's remilitarization of the Rhineland. Of course, that's not the case this time around, and with the Blum government being less attentive to Romania, Italy could use this opportunity to bring the country into its own sphere. In our world, France had maintained a largely left-wing anti-Italian government up until Germany's invasion, and even during this time, the subsequent Vichy government remained skeptical of Mussolini's ambitions upon France. There were a number of right-wing factions Mussolini could have propped up, such as the fascist French Popular Party of Jacques Doriot and the larger proto-de Gaullish French Social Party led by François Delarocque. However, the most realistic option for Mussolini would have been to support the return of former Prime Minister Pierre Laval. Laval had been an Italian sympathizer for quite some time. Like Mussolini, he had once been a socialist, but by the time of the Second Great War and France's occupation, he was fully on board with the Axis alliance. He was the French contact who suggested that Italy should hold free reign within the Horn of Africa, and he believed that ultimately France would need to cooperate with Italy to establish a reliable bloc on the continent against the eastern threats of Germany and the Soviet Union. The handling of the Stresa alliance and of Italy's invasion of Ethiopia was what ultimately brought about Laval's fall from power, and while it's likely Blum would have still taken power following Laval's term given the rising tide of centrist and left-wing collaboration, once Blum lost control of his coalition as he had in our world, there would be a realistic opportunity for Laval to rebound in this alternate timeline in 1938. Especially if he could rally more radical factions of the French right and win over moderates with his diplomatic success in pacifying Germany potentially being emboldened by the divided Blum government, the conflict in Spain, and once again trying to pressure Austria or the Sudetenland. Well, suppose that without the disgrace that followed the collapse of the Stresa Front, Laval is able to regain power in 1938 and fosters a close relationship with Italy. Without Germany to keep Britain invested in continental affairs, and with the end of the Spanish Civil War, Mussolini is able to consolidate his desired pan-Latin alliance of Italy, France, Spain, and Portugal. The French and the newly stabilized Spaniards happy to have a cohesive bloc of allies on the continent who oppose domination by Germany and Britain while maintaining a strong ideological buffer against the communism of the Soviet Union. This Latin Bloc or Union would not only be a countermeasure to German National Socialism, but an ideological counterweight on the European continent to communist ideology, one which drew other like-minded regimes into its orbit such as Austria, Romania, and eventually Hungary, Greece, and the whole or components of Yugoslavia. This paired with the bloc's concentration along the Mediterranean Sea would make it a force to be reckoned with, and in many ways a loose recreation of the Roman Empire that Mussolini had aspired to recreate. All that stood in the way was Britain with its holding of Egypt and other Mediterranean territories, and to a lesser extent Turkey, which kept the bloc from turning the Mediterranean into their personal harbor. But as its member states grew closer and grew in strength, they may attempt to make that vision a reality. But what do you think? What might have happened had Italy never joined the Axis powers? Let us know in the comments below. The US of Z thanks you for watching. Mr. Z, out.